Pacific regional event, where we will hear a presentation of the April 2023 East Asia and Pacific Economic Update entitled Reviving Growth. In this event, you'll hear first from EAP Regional Vice President Manuela V. Ferro, who will then introduce EAP Chief Economist Aditya Mattu to delve further into the report. After Aditya's presentation, we'll hear from our discussant this evening, EAP Regional Director for Equitable Growth, Finance, and Institutions, Hassan Zaman. Following that, Aditya will take questions, many of which have been submitted in advance, and also feel free to add questions in the chat, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. Please note that you can access live translations by pressing on the interpretation icon at the bottom of your screens. We have translations in Mandarin, Bahasa, Vietnamese, Mongolian, and Thai. And with that, let me turn it over to World Bank East Asia and Pacific Vice President Manuela V. Ferro.
Thank you very much. Good morning and good evening, everyone. Welcome to the World Bank and to this presentation of our latest East Asian Pacific Economic Update. We are coming together at a very complex time for policymakers in this region. On one hand, there are some good news. The region is recovering rather well from a number of shocks. First, the COVID pandemic that affected the whole world and this region as well. Second, commodity prices are still high. However, they started declining. And the region has managed well also in spite of tightening financial conditions that have been introduced to fight rather persistent inflation. Now, overall, growth in the region is bouncing back, and this is largely driven in 2023 by China's reopening, which really we expect will allow growth to rebound. And as a result, we expect growth in the region to increase from 3.5 in 2022 to over 5% in 2023. And so we expect poverty as a result to decline. I want to make a side note. In the Pacific Island states, output still remains below where it was before the pandemic started. So it is having a very significant and durable impact on the growth outlook in the region. Now, on the other hand, looking at the longer term, underlying trends show that the drivers of growth that this region has relied upon for so many years to bring poverty down, these drivers in and outside the region are weaker now. On one hand, the goods exports and private consumption that led recovery and growth in the region are weakening. So that export demand is not going to help the region recover. Second, and we focus this report very much on the longer term, and starting by looking at the underlying developments since the Asian financial crisis, growth in the region has been faster and more stable than in much of the rest of the world during the last couple of decades. And this has really translated into a very sharp decline in poverty and also a decline in inequality. But the aftermath of the Asian financial crisis also helped governments in the region introduce policy measures that made the region more resilient, and it helped it cope better with the recession that followed the 2008 financial crisis, and also with the COVID pandemic itself. So these achievements, however, obscure some vulnerabilities that are past and present and future. Now, I also wanted to mention that the convergence of East Asia Pacific countries with high-income countries, which had in the past been faster than in other developing countries, has now stalled. And looking back, the good macroeconomic management after the Asian financial crisis was accompanied only to a limited extent by reforms to enhance productivity. And the pace of structural reform stalled over the years 2000. So the region must cope with these problems even as it faces up with major challenges. We all are witnessing pressures to deglobalize, to which this region is particularly susceptible because it thrived through trade. In addition, the region is facing aging. It's growing old fast and at lower levels of income per capita than advanced economies did. And third, and certainly not least, climate change, to which this region
Recording in progress.
is both a victim and contributor. As usual, the goal of this update is to understand what's happening in the region, why it's happening, and what can be done about it. And with that, let me conclude and introduce our chief economist for the East Asia and Pacific region, Aditya Mathu, to present the report. Over to you, Aditya.
Thank you very much, Manuela, for that excellent overview and introduction to the report. You've set the stage for our presentation, which I'll begin to share now. Is the slideshow working, or is it you seeing all this other elements as well?
We see the notes as well.
Just give me 1 second. Sorry, I might disappear for a brief moment. Yes. Is this better, I guess?
I think so, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. So, as usual, as Manuela said, this update looks at proximate developments, recent developments, and looks ahead at what is about to happen. But unusually, it also takes a longer view, both looking back and looking ahead. But to begin with, I'll ask my colleague, Ergis Islamay, who is a co-leader of this venture, which is actually the product of many people's hard work, to first lead us through the recent developments and then provide a long view of growth. Ergis, over to you.
Many thanks, Aditya. So as Aditya mentioned, I'm going to start with the recent developments, which is the focus of our updates, what has happened next. And basically, when we look at the data and what we looked at what has been happening to the economies of the region in the short term, we see that much of developing East Asian Pacific countries have recovered from recent shocks. Countries like China, but also Vietnam, if you look now, the output is almost 15% higher than pre-pandemic, and other major economies also have been growing and catching up. But when we look at the broader set of countries, especially in the Pacific Island countries, as Manuela mentioned, output, the level of output remains still pre-pandemic levels. And if we look at countries like Samoa or Palau, we can see that at this point they are 15 to 20% less than pre-pandemic. Again, so we have this picture where there was growth in the short term, but some difficulties there. But this growth in the short term, which was substantial for some countries, was being driven by strong foreign demand, but also strong domestic demand. At the same time, while this was good news for 2022, we are seeing that in recent months, both domestic demand and foreign demand have been weakening. And if we look further at while during COVID, they had a hard time, but policy, the macroeconomic policy, was supportive to economic growth. Both fiscal policy first, so in 2020, also in 2021, they were mostly supportive. But then when we go to 2022, we see that for China, they provided a lot of fiscal stimulus, but in other economies, fiscal policy was less expansionary. So this is a slightly bit of a technical chart. What we show here is a change in structural balance. Just remember that a positive change means that there was basically less this year than last year, which means that they are kind of being more stringent on fiscal policy. On the monetary policy side, whereas we see that interest rates in the region are still lower than in other emerging markets and developing economies, still we notice that they have been increasing in the last year and 6 months especially, which means that monetary policy as well have become less expansionary. Thus, just to recap, the region has been growing, driven by domestic demand and foreign demand, which are now weakening a bit. Fiscal policy used to be more supportive to growth and now is less so. So moving ahead, this brings us to a good place, but what can we say about prospects in 2023? Well, while what we described is actually the foundations of solid growth, and it looks like things are not being overheated, at the same time, we should be a little watchful about the near-term growth prospects, because three international developments are likely to shape economic performance in the region. First is global growth. So when we put together these projections from our global economic prospects and the latest World Economic Outlook, we see that the world economy is expected to grow less in 2023 than it was in 2022, mainly driven by US, Europe, the major economies. And this is likely to hurt the exports of the region going forward. Also, there's a lot of uncertainty about commodity prices, although they have come down from their recent peaks recently. They still remain elevated, and higher commodity prices will hurt consumption in the region's economies. Lastly, again, there's also uncertainty about the financial conditions. Recent increases in interest rates in the US have led to financial tightening or tighter financial conditions in the region, and this is likely to hurt investment in the near term. So putting this all together, given these developments, on the one side, China is doing slightly better, much better for idiosyncratic reasons. So we project China to grow faster in 2023 than in 2022, but the rest of the region, or at least the major economies of the region, we expect them to slow down. So when we look individually at all the major economies, with the exception of Thailand, all the major economies will see a decrease in their growth in 2023 compared to 2022. So this brings us basically to, our recent developments and near-term outlook. But one thing that we did in this update, the first time that we did not do in previous updates, is we took a long view of what has been happening in the region with growth and also volatility of the growth. And our focus was mainly what happened after the Asian financial crisis, which has been a quarter century since the Asian financial crisis. And what we saw, and what the data shows, is that these economies of the region, for the last 2 decades or 2.5 decades, they have been growing faster, and the growth in this region have been more stable than in the rest of the world, including the advanced economies. And also not shown in this chart, but we all saw that during the Great Recession and during the COVID recession, most of the economies of the region prove more resilient than economies in other countries or in other regions. Consequently, one of the things that we see, together with a decrease in poverty and inequality, is that the economies of the region have all of them have transitioned either to lower or upper middle income status. So they are into that middle income category. We don't see any countries that are still low income in our region, which is a very good positive development. But these achievements do obscure some, or should not obscure some fundamental problems. For example, and this is also one of the things that Manuela very nicely brought in her introduction, is that even before COVID, East Asian economies were not catching up to growth to higher income economies. So this is probably one of the most technical charts that we chose for this presentation. But basically what we show here is this coefficient of catch up of developing economies to high income countries, and the right hand side is for the region. Being negative means there is catch up, and being statistically significant, which means that those bars are below zero, is also very good. gives us some confidence to say so. But what we noticed that especially after the global financial crisis, we saw that that catch-up waning, and that coefficient, technically speaking, has become statistically insignificant. At the same time, productivity growth in the region has been declining. And, even though it was maybe higher than other regions, we show it in other parts of the update, not here, but this labor productivity has been driven mostly, especially in the later period, has been driven mostly by capital deepening and not so much by the growth in total factor productivity, which is likely to contribute more to growth. So, coincidentally, these trends in growth and productivity that I just described have coincided with a movement, with a decline in the share of agriculture to total GDP and an increase in the share of manufacturing to GDP. So this pattern that I just said was mostly pronounced. It started in the 50s, but until the 90s, it was going strong. But since the mid-90s, basically since the Asian financial crisis, and then for some countries and for other countries during the global financial crisis, and these are the two highlighted areas in this chart, the gray areas, we saw that this increase in manufacturing was running out of steam, and actually manufacturing was even declining in some countries. This is especially true for this, what we refer to as early industrializers amongst the developing EAP countries, whereas a couple of still industrializing countries like Vietnam and Cambodia, we see that manufacturing is still increasing. And basically the sum of these three of agriculture, manufacturing, and services ends up to the total. So while manufacturing was declining and agriculture was also declining, services was increasing. Now, this reallocation, so basically this brings us to the reallocation of resources that underlines the structural change where resources are moving not to high productivity manufacturing, and actually they're not even moving to highly productive services sectors, but they are producing to less productive services sectors like trade and construction. At first look, it does not bode well for productivity growth, right? Because some services are less productive than what manufacturing used to be. And this is aligned with the facts that we just highlighted further. Now, well, we saw stable and steady growth, but not productivity enhancing structural change. So one question in our mind was why? Why is this? That, we always think of this stellar performance of the region, but now we don't see it in the statistics. It's almost like that famous quote. And in other parts of the update, hopefully you'll have a chance to look at it. What we see is that this after the Asian financial crisis, this region did really good in terms of sound macroeconomic management, and that contributed to both growth and stability, but we did not see as much productivity boosting structural reforms. So this is one thing that we noticed. But this shift into services, so again, it confirms to the patterns of basically it confirms the story that we told so far. But looking forward, it's not a story of doom and gloom, but we see that especially with the push in the technology adoption that came during COVID, this is an opportunity for these services to improve the productivity and add to the productivity of the region. Indeed, looking at the work that other colleagues at the World Bank did, we see that there has been a positive correlation between digitization and the productivity of the services sector. So going forward, we are hopeful that we're going to see higher productivity in services and figuring better ways to basically boost this highly tradable services that we are seeing nowadays. But needless to say, to reap the growth benefits of basically of the services sector, would require market-friendly structural reforms, right? When we look at the data across all reform areas for which we could find available indicators, and there's quite a few of them, we still that in many sectors, there's a significant gap between EAP economies and other advanced economies, and this gap is probably a little more pronounced in the services sector. So basically, to recap what I just said, we see that a little bit of stalling of growth and catch up to high income countries, but services provide an opportunity to boost that growth, and reforms can help in that area. I'm going to pass now back to Aditya Mathu, and he'll continue the presentation with the looming risks.
Thank you very much, Ergis. You very nicely described that, even by 2019, before COVID struck, this region's engine of growth and catch-up was running out of steam. Now, in the recent past, we have seen these multiple shocks, as Manuela described, the pandemic, the war, and financial tightening, which in previous updates we've shown might lead to a combination that the region has not seen in the 20th century, slowing growth and increased inequality. And the big problem is that the region must deal with these problems even as big challenges loom ahead. Perhaps most importantly, this is a region that has thrived through export-led growth in a world where markets were open and integrated. Now we see the emergence of trade tensions between its major trading partners, the United States and China. Now, in the short run, and the region has clearly benefited as the United States and China have imposed restrictions on each other, some trade has been diverted towards countries of the region. For example, Vietnam has stepped into China's shoes in the US market and increased its exports of, say, electronics. Indonesia has increased its exports in China's market. But we argue in this report that while these short-term benefits represent an opportunity as global value chains shift, in the longer term, there are reasons to be concerned for at least 4 reasons. First of all, instead of trade being determined by dependable economic fundamentals and predictable trade rules, political factors are now influencing the pattern of trade. And that phenomenon, which has been referred to as friendshoring, creates a degree of uncertainty which can hurt third countries by inhibiting trade and investment. Secondly, there is a risk that as different countries and different large markets adopt different standards, there could be a segmentation of markets. And that would hurt third countries because it would prevent their ability for exploiting or ability to exploit economies of scale in an integrated global market. The third problem is that some of these restrictions that we are seeing are not merely restrictions on bilateral trade. These are restrictions on where products are ultimately consumed. For example, a semiconductor produced in my country, where it becomes part of a product produced in a second country, and then my prohibition applies to exports to a third country. And similarly, there are restrictions on imports, which relate also to the ultimate source of the inputs. And that is a problem for a region which is deeply enmeshed in international global value chains, both with the United States and with China. These types of restrictions could erode many of the benefits this region has derived from this high-level specialization which global value chains represent. But perhaps most serious concern, which we have highlighted in this report with new empirical work, is that restrictions on knowledge flows could adversely affect innovation. Certainly, we see already evidence that some of these restrictions are hurting the innovation of Chinese firms which used to collaborate with US inventors. But we also see adverse effects on the innovation of US firms which used to rely on collaboration with Chinese inventors. So that leads us to conclude that these bilateral restrictions could in effect reduce global flows of knowledge. And that matters for this region because innovation in this region relies heavily on innovation in other parts of the world. When you look at patents in the region, they cite patents most of all and most recently from the United States and other advanced countries, but now increasingly also from China. And that is our big concern, that if these knowledge flows shrink, then it would hurt innovation, productivity, and growth in the region, especially at a time where all countries in the world are looking for these transformative green technologies which help to reduce emissions without sacrificing productivity. So apart from this one big concern about what is happening outside the region, the other big concern is what's happening inside the region. But before I go there, let me just say what we do think the region can do on its own to deal with these difficulties. First, as we have argued in previous updates, the best response to a world which is retreating from globalization is not retaliation, but reform. Deeper reform of the region's own trade and investment policies of the kind that we have seen recently in Indonesia and the Philippines. More in investment, but not so much in trade. The second conclusion in this report is that when your two large trading partners draw apart, your best response is not to join one in an exclusive trade bloc, but to become a hub rather than a spoke by actually forming good, deep trade agreements with each of the large trading partners. And that, as a tribute to the wisdom of the leaders of this region, is precisely what they have been trying to do. For example, the RCEP agreement has successfully created a meaningful mutual market access agreement with China, which arguably is not as deep as, for example, the CPTPP agreement, but is still valuable. Ideally, the countries of the region would form similar agreements with the United States, which they do not have yet. And also the recent Indo-Pacific initiative has not really been conceived of as a trade agreement. So ideally, a multilateral, global, rules-based system, a second best, is deep trade agreements with all trading partners. Turning now to the other big challenge, which is aging. And here the region faces a particular challenge because of the pace of aging. Countries like France, the United States, and UK took about 100 years to move from a state where about 7% of their population was over the age of 65 to when it became twice that level. Countries in the region will see that change in 20 years. And they will age when they're still poor. The levels of income, per capita income in the region, when working age population reaches peak levels, will be only about 20 to 40% the income levels of a country like the United States when its working age population reached the peak. So that presents a serious problem for a region that will age faster and when it is relatively poor. And we identify at least three big problems. A lower share of the conventional working age population could hurt productivity. It could hurt comparative advantage because it changes the endowments of the region. Unless the region finds a way to ensure that older people continue to work productively through measures such as changes in age discriminatory laws, through facilitating their participation through training, as countries like Singapore are doing, and harnessing new technologies to give them better opportunities. The second challenge is the burden of pensions, which is going to grow and become a real impediment to growth by crowding out investment, unless the gap is narrowed between the contributions people make and the benefits they eventually receive, especially in countries like China and Vietnam, where there are large civil service pension commitments of the state. Reforms of this kind are going to be crucial. Then we come to the problem of health. Age-related non-communicable diseases like diabetes and hypertension are going to become a bigger problem, and healthcare needs to be rethought to prevent, control, and manage these diseases across the whole life cycle. You cannot wait to treat these diseases when people are old. You have to try and prevent these diseases when people are young, both to ensure that people are healthy and healthcare does not impose a debilitating cost burden on these economies. Finally, we turn to arguably an existential challenge, not just for the region, but the world: climate change. Now, we have in previous reports, and the World Bank has highlighted the need for the world to work together to curb emissions and prevent global warming. But in this report, we emphasize the fact the region is not just a contributor to climate change, it is hugely susceptible to the effects of climate change. Whether it is rising oceans and what they will do to the densely populated coastal areas, or droughts and high levels of temperature and what they'll do to the productivity of farming in the interior, or the melting glaciers and what they're going to do to access to water. So we argue that, really drawing on excellent work by the World Resource Institute, showing that we are perhaps seriously underestimating the benefits of investments in adaptation. When we improve flood control or install early warning systems, we do not simply avoid losses, but we also reap big economic and environmental benefits. For example, planting mangroves is going to help abate coastal surges, but it also leads to supporting local fisheries and forestry, and it stores carbon. This triple dividend means that such investments can have benefits which are up to 10 times greater than the costs. So one central argument in this report is that we have underinvested perhaps in adaptation, and we have also underinvested in understanding how investments are best made in adaptation. Now, to conclude, I'll just summarize the 4 types of policy action that this report argues are needed. First, to build on the sound macroeconomic policies the region has followed, as Manuela and Ergis pointed out, we now need deeper macro financial reforms which enhance the capacity of the state to support recovery today and inclusive growth tomorrow. Secondly, as Ergis nicely pointed out, we need structural reforms, especially to remedy this huge reform gap in the services sector, to boost innovation and productivity, not just in the services sector where a lot of people now are employed and moving, but also because reforms in services will help boost productivity in manufacturing and agriculture. Third, we emphasize, as I just said, climate reforms, but especially those which enhance resilience through efficient adaptation. And finally, and I hope not too optimistically, we emphasize the need for international cooperation, most obviously to deal with the problem of global warming by inducing collective action to reduce emissions, but also to ensure continued openness to trade, investment, and technology flows. These agreements would ideally be multilateral, but we believe that even regional and bilateral cooperation could be fruitful. Thank you very much for listening to this long presentation. But now I turn to my colleague, Hassan Zaman, who is the director of the Equity, Finance and Institutions team in the East Asia region, but also somebody with whom and with whose team we have collaborated closely to produce this report. So he is half author and half commentator. So over to you, Hassan.
Thanks so much, Aditya, and congratulations really on a superb piece of work, and really as extremely insightful as ever. Very well done to the whole team. So I'd like to focus my comments on three areas, Aditya. First, on your points about long-term growth and structural change, and some reflections on what the region can learn and possibly should avoid from other Asian countries who are now high income. That part will be slightly longer than the other 2 points. The other will be on your point about trade integration in East Asia and why, in my view, the emergence of the Asian middle class can be a buffer against global uncertainties. And thirdly, I'd like to say something about recent banking stress in the US and Europe and some lessons for East Asia. First, on the structural change point, you talked and showed data very convincingly about how productivity has slowed. And this clearly presents new challenges for many East Asia countries that aspire to become high income over the next generation or two. And there are several, such as Vietnam and Philippines, have set explicit targets about when they'd like to get there. Here, I think there are several valuable lessons from the Korean experience, a country which I recently visited and spent some time to try and learn a bit more about their own development trajectory. And it's a country which, as many of you know, has moved from low to high income in only 60 years at record speed. And some of those lessons have been well documented, and these include the focus on macro stability, investments in different stages of education, the role of effective state institutions in promoting the private sector, a focus on export-driven development, a financial sector which is able to finance this growth, an environment conducive to promoting technological innovation. And you could argue that many other countries in East Asia, they're making progress in many of these areas that I've just mentioned, to a greater or lesser extent. But I'd like to highlight the role of innovation policy, which is key to boosting productivity, and where I see the biggest differences between Korea and other currently middle-income Asian countries. So in this context, a comparison between Korea and Vietnam is illustrative. In terms of per capita income, Vietnam now is where Korea was in 1987. Yet back then, i.e. 1987, Korea's research and development spending was 1.5% of GDP, whereas Vietnam's now is 0.4% of GDP. Not surprisingly then, Vietnam produces significantly fewer patents, i.e. a proxy for innovation, than Korea did at the same income level. Moreover, now, Korea spends a whopping 5% of GDP on R&D, and 80% of that is spending by the private sector, spurred by incentives by the government, such as tax exemptions on R&D spending. Consequently, the number of international patent applications increased from less than 2,000 in 1970 to more than 200,000 in 2021. And most of this research is applied research directly related to improving the productivity of the manufacturing export base. But innovation policy in Korea goes beyond spending on R&D. It includes specialized government entities providing technology-driven solutions and financing for these to promising startups. It also includes specialized higher education institutions ensuring a supply of high-skilled labor to meet the needs of the industrial ecosystem. And as a result of these coordinated initiatives, as Korea developed, it went from middle to high income. Its major knowledge source changed from imported knowledge to accumulated experience and knowledge within the country, which has been a key determinant, I think, of moving out of this middle income trap. I think that there are several lessons which can be transferable in this context, and we are supporting several countries in the region with learning from Korea's innovation policy, including twinning arrangements between equivalent institutions to our Korea office. Yet coming back, and this is on the flip side of the point that I'd like to make about income transitions, yet coming back to this rapid growth model, there are certain shortcomings of Korea's development experience, which other countries should take note of. So, and that, in my view, largely relates to shared prosperity concerns. The industrials, or the lack thereof. The industrial structure in Korea is highly concentrated among a handful of too big to fail firms. There are growing concerns about wealth inequality and home affordability. The gender pay gap of 34% between men and women doing the same job compares with 13% among other OECD countries. Korea also has one of the lowest fertility rates in the world, partly reflective of how the youth view future prospects. So recognizing the importance of focusing on equity is perhaps a lesson as countries try to emulate Korea's obvious success in increasing per capita income. Growth with shared prosperity is therefore, in my view, just as important, and there are pathways that one can achieve both. And this could be, and your report, as well as previous of your reports that you produced, have documented those. And those include supporting equity through fiscal policy, broadening educational opportunities, and labor market reforms, which reduce gender gaps. That's the first point. It's the slightly longer one that I wanted to make, which is on income transitions and lessons not to learn as well. Second point is about trade integration. Your report very well highlights that East Asia is susceptible to international trade tensions between the US and China, and associated policy uncertainty, and the implications on innovation, which you very nicely spelled out. And this is certainly of concern. However, there is another powerful force that is reshaping global and regional trade, and that is more to do with the demand than the demand side than the supply side, and that is East Asia's growing middle class. Initially, intra-regional trade was driven by intermediate goods as the global value chains encouraged greater specialization and spread across borders, while final demand remained in the US, EU, and Japan. Now, the source of global demand is shifting. For example, in 2000, only 12% of East Asia's exports were consumed in East Asia. In 2020, this jumped to 31%. Recent work by colleagues in our department have shown that the composition of spending by the global middle class will change dramatically over the next decade, with a share from the US and the EU falling from 40% in 2016 to 30% in 2035, while the share from East Asia will rise from 14 to 22%. As a result, inter-regional trade increasingly reflects exports of final goods for consumption in East Asia. So why is this relevant for policymakers? It's relevant because domestically, policies to support household income, particularly during shocks, could help bolster the role of private consumption. And externally, policies to lower barriers to regional trade could foster deeper regional integration along with implementing the regional trade agreements, which Aditya, you referred to. In other words, the stronger policies to support stronger intra-regional trade and economic integration can help diversify not just supply chains, but also sources of demand, which can act as a buffer against uncertainties in global trade and growth. Final point I'd like to make is on bank-related stress and lessons for East Asia. I think we all know what has gone on recently in the banking sector in the US and Europe. And while the causes of the weaknesses in the specific banks varied, there are some common lessons from these events, and I'd like to highlight 4 of these lessons for East Asia. First, effective regulation, supervision, and enforcement are critical to curb excessive risk-taking during good times and to identify potential weaknesses before it's too late. Regularly monitoring of quantitative metrics is not a substitute for on-site supervision, but this requires adequate staffing and capacity. Secondly, capital and liquidity buffers remain a critical first line of defense, and we have countries in the region where capital adequacy ratios for some banks clearly need to be raised. Third, it pays to be prepared. This includes established backstop mechanisms, such as deposit insurance and liquidity support arrangements and resolution tools. The US FDIC proved impressively capable of winding down a bank and transferring all its assets and liabilities to a bridge bank over the course of a weekend. In parts of East Asia, significant efforts are still needed to ensure deposit insurance agencies meet such levels of operational readiness. And finally, communication by authorities during a crisis is crucial to mitigate contagion, restore confidence, and support an orderly resolution. Gaps in crisis management communication remain an important area for further improvements in East Asia. We are working on all 4 of these aspects with our counterparts in the financial sector in East Asia to make progress in these directions. So with these 3 points, let me pass it back to you, Aditya, and thanks very much once again for superb work and excellent collaboration between our teams. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hassan, for these very thoughtful and perceptive remarks. I agree with all the points that you made. I just would also like to point out that the innovation question was dealt with in some depth in work led by my colleague Andrew Mason and Xavier Serrera, who I think are here today, as well as Francesca De Nicola and Trang Tutan. So I do agree with all the points you made. So we have about now, the good news is we have more than 400 people watching this event through different media, including Facebook and YouTube. And we have lots of questions that have already come in and are likely to come in as we speak. And I would like to now call upon some of my colleagues who have contributed to this report, and this is also a way of acknowledging their contribution to respond to those questions. I would request that responses be kept within 3 minutes, ideally, so we have time to run through as many questions as possible. And to begin with, I have a question on, let me just look at this. Yeah, it's from Professor Baja of the Partido State University in the Philippines, Nguyen Thi Phong Liang of Help the Aged in Vietnam. And it says, what reforms are important to tackle the challenges of an aging population in the current economic climate? What role can migration policies play in mitigating these problems? So reforms in general and migration policies in particular. And to respond to this question, I'll turn to Philip O'Keefe, who is the person who produced this excellent section on aging for the update. And he is a former bank staff member and one of the most knowledgeable people in this area. I hope, Philip, you're in the audience, and I hope you will now be able to respond to this question.
Thank you, Aditya. Yes, thank you for the question also. I apologize, my camera is not working, but so you'll continue to see Aditya while I talk. Overall, on the aging story, and I see there's been a lot of comments in the chat already on this subject, very insightful ones. I think there are many areas one can deal with, but I think there are 3 key ones that we deal with in the report. But let me first start by saying that in dealing with an aging society, 2 things are important to say. Firstly, it's not all doom and gloom. One often reads things that are the silver tsunami or other characterizations of societal aging. I think it's important not to enter the discussion with that mindset, but to look at the balance of risks and opportunities. Secondly, that dealing with an aging society is not just about elderly people. It's about all of society and whole of life course reforms to navigate societal aging and realize the opportunities and mitigate the risks. The 3 areas in the report we look at, first is in the labour market. Clearly, in an aging society, if nothing is done, you will have a shrinking working age population, and that will create challenges and shift comparative advantage, as Aditya said. On that front, one needs to deal with both quantity and quality issues. On the quantity side, maximising labour force participation for the population that you have, the 3 key areas are clearly female labour force participation and increasing that, and particularly in some countries in the region where we know it's very low, 30, 40% in some countries. Secondly is extending working lives, productive working lives, in different ways. And the third is migration, where this region is a mix of young and old countries, and the opportunities for mutual benefit there are great, and I'll come back to that in a moment. All of those need policy support. They don't happen by themselves. They need surrounding policies on labour market regulation, things like care policies, workplace adaptations, incentives for employers and employees, tax reforms, etc. On the quality side of things, a lot of Asia is already moving in the right direction in terms of improving basic education and equality over time. But still there's an enormous way to go. We see the numbers on learning poverty in the region are 90% or higher in some countries. So clearly foundational education to improve the quality of your future workforce is key. But for your existing workforce, I think the more complex challenge perhaps, or equally complex challenge, is adult learning. And most of our countries lack a system that allows for lifelong learning over the life course, upskilling, upgrading of skills over the life course, and adaptation to the new demands of the labour market. The second, which Aditya mentioned, is automation. As your society ages, as you potentially have fewer workers, that increasing automation to complement labour and capital is really important. And Asimoglu and others have looked at this and seen that the countries that are able to deal with those things in complementary ways don't see the negative growth effects of an ageing population that maybe others who do that less well do. And the third is that there are opportunities here. I think it was mentioned in the chat of the silver economy, of the growing spending power of that older population and the opportunities that offers to producers and employers. The second area is health systems, and clearly here you want a population that as it ages remains healthy and remains productive. So how do you get this healthy longevity? The key thing here, I think, is the non-communicable disease epidemic in the region, and how do you reorient health systems? Greater emphasis on primary care and prevention, but a range of tools such as taxation policy on tobacco and alcohol, and things that we know exacerbate and increase non-communicable diseases. Not health systems per se, but related to that is long-term care systems. Nearly all our countries have at best nascent formal long-term care systems and often absent long-term care systems. Developing that is useful both for the people themselves, for older people to have a better quality of life and welfare, and that should be more emphasising home and community-based care, but also to free up the people who are caring for them now, their families, particularly women, to allow them to work. If you need more women to work in an ageing society, you need to complement traditional forms of care and support. The third area we look at is pension systems, and here you've got a dual challenge. You've got the fiscal pressures from existing systems, particularly civil service systems, which are overly and unsustainably generous in many of the countries, but also often in the main systems for formal sector workers, which are often not actuarially balanced and need to orient to that. But at the same time, you've got undercoverage of older people and future older people. So there it needs a lot more innovation to increase coverage in the informal sector in a way that kind of takes account of the fiscal challenges that lie ahead with an ageing population. Just a little more, two more words on migration in response to
Philip, I would ask you to, because we have lots of questions.
Okay, sure. Let me stop there.
We cannot.
Yep, sure. I'll stop there then.
Thank you very much, Philip. That was very thoughtful and very helpful. And your writings will become more public soon, and so it'll be great to disseminate them, and we are happy to do that. Let me turn to a second question, which deals with the other big challenge that we identified in the report, and which was an adaptation, and where we benefited enormously from the work of Carter Brandon and others at the World Resources Institute. And the question is, how can countries adapt to the challenges of climate change without sacrificing growth in the short term? Are there win-win policies to revive growth and address climate change at the same time? And how can the World Bank support countries? Now, Mona Sur, who is working on these issues for the bank, I will ask her to respond, but Mona, you have to be a bit minimalistic. You cannot respond to all aspects of this question. And so I just want you to convey the essence of what are the policies and what does the bank do. Thank you. Are you there?
Thanks very much, Aditya. Yes, I'm here, and I'll try to be concise. So there are, in fact, many win-win opportunities to support adaptation and at the same time promote growth. We know that some of the climate change impacts on economic growth manifest through the impacts on infrastructure, the impacts on key economic sectors such as agriculture, and certainly on people through the impacts on health, for example. So some potential win-win policies include those that involve promoting resilient infrastructure. And this can significantly reduce disruptions to the economy. For example, excessive flooding disrupts critical transport networks, as well as the mobility of goods, services, and people. So adaptation measures, including policies that support strengthening and upgrading construction standards for transport, energy, as well as other lifeline infrastructure, for example, levees, embankments, and appropriate building codes, are good for adaptation as well as good for growth. Similarly, we know that policies that promote better planning and zoning help avoid development in flood-prone areas. You mentioned this, Aditya. But these investments and policies, along with appropriate infrastructure, both great infrastructure as well as nature-based solutions, as well as policies that incentivize proper operation and maintenance, can really reduce waterlogging and the impacts of flooding. Similarly, early warning systems, along with the improved ability to evacuate people, will significantly reduce the damages from extreme events and are good for growth. This is also true of policies that promote climate-smart agricultural practices, including incentivizing small-scale irrigation in water-scarce areas, improving efficiency of water use, rationalizing crop choices and agricultural practices, and managing coastal ecosystems, to name a few. And these policies would improve livelihoods and provide protection, and therefore are also win-win. And then finally, let me mention policies that strengthen social protection and healthcare systems. These policies, as well as measures that reduce some of the heat island effects that we are learning much more about, that are closely related with climate change, could significantly reduce the health and productivity losses and are also clearly win-win. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mona, and that was very helpful. I should have said that this question was asked, or variants of this question were asked by Mark McKenzie, Hamid Mohtadi, and Bayar Sai Khan and Lawrence Connell. And the next question is from Daniel Ramil, who is at the Land Bank of the Philippines. Or, you know, I'm paraphrasing questions, so please don't worry if you don't exactly recognize your question. And this is about linked to the very nice point that Hassan was making about what types of reforms would boost innovation and productivity of firms in manufacturing and services in EAP economies. And for this, I am going to turn to Xavier Serrera, who along with my colleague Andy Mason and others led our work on innovation in the region. So Xavier, a crisp, ideally 2-3 minute response, and then you can advertise your work and people will read it.
Thank you. Thanks, Aditya. So let me be telegraphic here. I think one of the key issues first in terms of structural reforms is to create enabling conditions for innovation. And I think one particular element that is super important looking at the slowdown in productivity growth in the region is to encourage entry and all the reforms that then enhance market dynamics and business dynamism. We've seen, for example, in the case of China, how a lot of the productivity growth has been driven by new entrants. And it's quite important that we do that in a region that very often is dominated by large companies and large conglomerates that dominate the economy, and sometimes they have killer mergers that can undermine the emergence of new startups. A second element in terms of structural reform is to keep trying to attract foreign investment. As you mentioned before, the issue of technology diffusion it's been always very important, but it's going to be even more important going forward, and to try to establish these incentives at the same time of policies that create the linkages with these foreign firms is very important. And let me mention another area where we have been doing some work in other countries, like in the Philippines, which is about strengthening the intellectual property rights system, which that can provide actually a lot of value to sectors like the creative industries that actually have a large potential in some of these countries. So I think this first block is very important about these reforms that can create these enabling conditions for innovation. Let me just very briefly mention a second block that is around what the government policies can be in order to support this innovation. First one is improving access to financing. We already discussed this at length in the innovation imperative report about the lack of finance for innovation in the region, and the government can play a role in here, trying to work with commercial banks in order to create these lines of credit or credit guarantees. One other important element is to encourage entrepreneurship. That's critical to support entry, to bring new players to markets, and create this creative destruction that can improve innovation and productivity growth. And just to finalize, let me link a little bit more with the report on the innovation imperative in terms of the sort of policies to encourage innovation, because the work that we have done in the region suggests that a lot of the institutions that are supporting innovation are often not fit for purpose. They focus too much on creating public R&D, not so much on the links to commercialization. They are often fragmented and they have quite a large degree of unnecessary overlaps and inefficiencies. And I think reforming these institutions is also quite critical to spur innovation in the region. Let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Xavi. And let me advertise again the excellent report, which is on our website, which you and Andy and others have produced, which looks at some of these questions in much greater detail. Now, let me turn to a question about a specific country. It comes from Xi Xiaoping and Stevie Leonard Harrison. And the question is, how strong is China's recovery? Are we really going to see China grow by more than 5% this year? Is there a tension between keeping growth high in the short term and improving the quality of the growth in the longer term? And to answer this question, I'm going to turn to Elitsa Mileva, who is our lead economist. Last time, you'll remember, we had lots of country directors, and this time we are turning to the lead economists who are our closest allies in the countries. So Elitsa, a crisp answer in 2-3 minutes, and direct everybody to reading the excellent box we have in the report on this question. But over to you.
Thank you, Aditya. Yes, so our baseline projection for growth in China this year is 5.1%, and we expect this solid recovery to be driven by domestic demand and in particular household consumption in China. As consumer sentiment has already begun to recover, that will be the main driver of growth. We also expect the domestic investment will remain robust because business sentiment is expected to recover. However, having said that, there are a number of risks to this outlook. For example, the property market weakness can persist for longer. Global growth can be slower than expected. There are financial risks in China's economy, the difficult geopolitical environment, and also risks stemming from climate change. And so if any of these risks to growth materialize this year, we expect the government to have sufficient policy space to respond. However, as our participant asked, it is quite likely that support to short-term growth can come with trade-offs to improving the quality of growth in China in the long run. And I'll give you just one example. So, for example, during the COVID pandemic, China's government implemented a large fiscal stimulus support that consisted to a large part in infrastructure investment. However, there were trade-offs with respect to China's transition to carbon neutrality and also with its longer-term aim of redirecting growth to be driven more by productivity. So because traditional infrastructure in China is no longer a constraint to growth, now the returns to infrastructure investment are lower, which means that growth is slowed down just by using this particular kind of stimulus. In addition, traditional infrastructure investments such as building roads, for example, can be more carbon intensive compared to other forms of stimulus. And so what can the government do to try to minimize these short-term versus long-term growth trade-offs. For example, the government can allocate more of its fiscal stimulus towards spending on green infrastructure rather than traditional infrastructure. In the future, the returns to green infrastructure in China will be higher as the economy decarbonizes. And then the government can also allocate more fiscal expenditure towards social services and away from investment. For example, the coverage and the benefits of China's social security system can be expanded. And this way, households can be encouraged to save less for the future and spend more today. And so this will support both rebalancing towards higher quality growth or growth that is more dependent on consumption, and also reduce the carbon intensiveness of the fiscal stimulus. Now, China would also need higher social spending to offset some of the expected negative welfare effects of the transition to green growth. For example, it's quite likely that energy prices in China will rise as the economy decarbonizes, which will put pressure on household budgets. And also jobs will be lost in many carbon-intensive industries. And so government support will be needed to offset these impacts. So I'll stop here, Aditya. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elisa, for that thoughtful response. I think these are the questions which matter not just for China, but for the whole world. So we'll follow them closely, and I think we should deepen our analysis of these questions under your leadership. Let me turn now to the lead economist for Indonesia, Habib Rab, if he's there, and ask him an interesting question which has come from Yingying Li, R. C. Nugroho, and Rudolfo Balmeta, which is that Indonesia has introduced a series of export restrictions as part of their industrial policy. Will they succeed in boosting growth? How will they impact small and medium enterprises and startups compared to larger incumbents? So, Habib, you have to tackle this difficult question. You're a little bit in the dark yourself, but you will hopefully illuminate us all with your response.
Thank you very much, Aditya. So on the goals of greater industrialization and increased participation in regional and global value chains, I mean, these are, of course, very, very important and legitimate. But the question for us is more, what is the appropriate, instrument or policies that will help promote that greater industrialization and GVC participation. And in this regard, Indonesia has done well to reform its investment regime, which will and in fact is helping small and medium-sized enterprises. In fact, our last Indonesia economic prospects released in December point to how those reforms have been associated with rising investments in those sectors that have been liberalized. And so in our view, those investment liberalization reforms could well be complemented by liberalization of Indonesia's trade regime also, which we discussed also in our last IEP, which focused on trade reforms. And the reason is that the numbers show that decline in trade openness since the Asian financial crisis coincides with a falling share of manufacturing and industrial output in total GDP. So given the complementarity between trade and investment policies, shifting the focus to trade reforms would allow, in our view, Indonesia to realize the potential of the investment reforms that it has undertaken through the Jobs Omnibus Law to boost diversification and industrial output. And we see this in other countries like Malaysia and Vietnam that have benefited enormously from importing to export and progressively deepen their participation and in value chains. And in our view, it would make sense for Indonesia to exhaust the benefits from market-based reforms to allow for development of higher value added and more advanced domestic industries, as the benefits of those reforms will likely be greater and costs lower for overall industrialization and growth compared to trade restrictions. But as you said, Aditya, this is something that we will be looking at further over the coming months. Thank you very much. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Habib, for that expectedly thoughtful response. Let me now turn to the lead economist for the Pacific countries, David Gould, and ask him a question which has come from Shivneel Kumar Raj and C. Nikalkal. The question is, the Pacific Islands have still not recovered to the pre-COVID GDP, as I guess it just showed us, unlike most countries in the region. In the face of these challenges, what can the Pacific Island countries do to boost growth? Now, David, this is a very big question, and I cannot expect you to provide a comprehensive answer, but maybe some few insights from somebody who's worked in many different parts of the bank and made fantastic contributions. What would you say?
Thank you very much, Aditya, and thank you for the report. It's really, I think, a very comprehensive report, and a lot of the elements that came out of the main report, I think, apply to the Pacific as well, although with quite a substantive nuances. So, as was noted by the question itself, the Pacific has yet overall to recover fully from the pandemic. Many countries are still below 2019 levels in terms of GDP, but that's not all the countries. Some of the countries actually are above 2019, and those are the fishing dependent countries, those that depend on fishing license revenues. Kiribati and Tuvalu have done relatively well. Those that were hurt the most are the travel and tourism dependent economies, and those while they're seeing a real jump in tourism, still haven't reached the 2019 levels. Sometime in 2023, we do expect Fiji and possibly Palau in 2024, but overall the region is probably not on average going to recover until next calendar year, early sometime. So you really have to distinguish the Pacific countries because they're very different in many ways. But in the first instance, in the near term, I think it's a matter of kickstarting the industries that really provided growth in the first place, and that's tourism and travel. Tourism, being the lifeblood of Fiji, Palau, and to some degree Samoa, Tonga, and Vanuatu, really need to start again. And that is, building back from where they were and the loss of many jobs in that area, attracting them back to the industry and providing, renewed services in the hotel industry, travel and the like. Palau is still suffering from lack of connectivity in airlines. And once that gets back on, they'll be able to see some growth. In the medium term, I think it's a much more fundamental issue, and that is creating efficiencies in government spending. Some of the very necessary, important COVID spending that took place to support individuals need to be wound down to create fiscal and debt sustainability in the region. But it has to be done in a careful way because, as was also noted, the world, and particularly the Pacific, has been hit hard by, first the COVID pandemic and now the war on Ukraine, which jacked up energy prices and food prices, which the Pacific Islanders depend completely on. So when you talk about trade dependence and the importance of trade, Pacific is critical in that. They're small island countries dependent on importing most essential goods. So they'll need to wind down some of these temporary measures, and they'll need to focus those resources on building back. And then this is the last point, on more fundamental long-term growth areas. And that's some no-risk investments, particularly on education. The Pacific, many of the countries are below, significantly below their similar income peers on educational attainment, and that's through our human capital index. That also includes health. Health is a huge issue in the Pacific, particularly on non-communicable diseases, obesity and the like. And that's because of the lack of diversification in the food basket that many of the Pacific Islanders have. And that also relates to the other long-term issue, and that is providing connectivity, or providing the means to diversify your income. And you can diversify income even within the tourism industry by creating these value chains within the country. So rather than importing food in those countries that do have arable land, providing that food for not only domestic consumption, but also hotels and the like. Digital connectivity can broaden the diversification of the country, support education as well by supplementing, these small schools with maybe, 20 students from elementary to high school with digital supplements and education that is brought in from, for example, Australia or New Zealand or the US to improve the overall capabilities of providing education. All those things will be really critical for long-term growth. And of course, there's the issue with climate change, but I'll leave that for another day.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you. This is very helpful, and this is part of a longer conversation that we are all having and should continue. The next question, I'll turn to the lead economist for Vietnam, Andrea Coppola. And the question comes from Nguyen Thi Tuet, Nguyen Hong Dung, and Mahazrul bin Kamaluddin. And the question is, Vietnam's growth model has so far relied on a large workforce coupled with large inflows of foreign investment. What are the major constraints to continuing on this path? For example, how are changes due to technologies like automation and changes in global value chains due to reshoring likely to impact Vietnam's long-term growth? So Andrea, again, you're the author of a major forthcoming study on Vietnam's prospects, and it'll be good if you give us just the tip of the iceberg of the challenges. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Aditya. I think to respond to this question, it's important to consider three elements. First, we should consider Vietnam's ambition to become a high-income country by 2045. And according to World Bank estimates, to achieve this goal, GDP per capita should grow at an average rate of about 6% per year in real terms during the next 2 decades. Second, we should consider that the demographic dividend is now nearly spent in Vietnam, and Vietnam's population is projected to become aged by 2035. And by age, we mean a situation in which the elderly represent between 10% and 20% of the population. And this is going to have an impact on Vietnam's workforce and on the contribution of workforce to economic growth. And third, the aging of the population, besides affecting the workforce, might also decrease Vietnam's admirably high female labor force participation, as women might decide to pick up the increasing care burden. So in such a context, to achieve the growth rates required to reach high-income status by 2045, Vietnam will need to offset the impact of demographic trends by updating its growth model by putting productivity, growth, and center, and promoting a more efficient use of its main assets, such as private capital, public capital, human capital, and natural capital. As for the second part of the question, changes due to technology like automation and changes in global supply chains due to reshoring create both opportunities and challenges. Automation is expected to be productivity enhancing. At the same time, it could create social risks associated with job losses that could be mitigated through reskilling and upskilling of affected workers. Reshoring might end up favoring Vietnam to the extent that the country continues to be seen as a reliable destination for international investors. On the other hand, potential challenges associated with reshoring out of Vietnam could be addressed by boosting the development of the domestic private sector. And look, I also saw a question in the chat about the drivers of growth in Vietnam for 2023. So let me respond very quickly also to that. Just to say that we do expect both domestic demand and external demand to continue playing a role, but contribution to growth is going to be weaker than in 22, particularly from external demand, which might be affected by weaker demand by main trade partners. And also domestic demand, as private consumption and investment might be affected by a relatively higher inflation. Now, On the supply side, tourism sector might constitute a bright spot as it is expected to recover. But let me advertise a World Bank publication that we launched just 2 weeks ago. It's the Vietnam Taking Stock, where we elaborate on the drivers of growth in 2023. So I invite everybody to look at it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andrea. You know, I'm of a generation which focuses on one thing, which is your responses, but I've been looking at the chat, and there are, first of all, I must compliment Jacqueline Wong for her thoughtful remarks. I found one question, several questions interesting, but one from Steve Harrison, which asks about inequality. So let me turn to my colleague, Andrew Mason. And Andy, the question that we could ask is, you know, we've talked a lot about impact on growth, but these big challenges that EAP countries face, what are the implications for poverty and inequality? If you can give us a brief response, that'll be great.
Thanks, Aditya. Thanks very much for the question.
I don't hear you very well, so if you can.
Can you hear me any better now? There we go. Can you hear me better now?
I think that was a crucial technical innovation.
Yes, I'm glad I figured it out. So thanks for the question. Look, as the report points out, I think very clearly, growth over the last 25 years has really been the driver and a very powerful driver of poverty reduction in the region. Redistribution and redistributional policies have played a role, but really growth has been a driver. And will continue to be over the future. So if we think about the challenges to growth and some of the big challenges forthcoming, what does that mean for poverty reduction? Let me just go quickly through the big three that you covered in the report. The first one on decoupling, as the report points out, I think very clearly, decoupling, should it proceed, deglobalization can adversely affect productivity, can affect innovation through impeding knowledge flows and through that growth. And through that channel also can result in slowing poverty reduction. Now, this won't kill growth. I don't mean to say that poverty will go up, but it will slow. Similarly, we've heard, and in the climate change and development reports carried out recently in East Asia, we know that climate change, if action is not taken, will also impede growth and will therefore also have an effect on poverty reduction. But in the case of climate change, we also need to worry about the impact of climate shocks. And we know from existing evidence that climate shocks almost always hit the poor and vulnerable more than they do others, either through affecting their households, maybe the infrastructure isn't as strong, maybe through their enterprises, especially if they're working in agriculture. And here really points again to the importance of investments in adaptation that I think the report makes so powerfully. Elitsa also pointed to the point about the energy transition in countries attacking climate change and potential labor dislocation. And again, this is something in the absence of compensatory or social policies to support those dislocated could also result in higher poverty. And finally, if we look at aging, Pip O'Keefe in his remarks mentioned low coverage of pensions in the region in the face of high labor informality. And this is important because as societies age, we start to worry in the absence of pension coverage, what's going to happen to income insecurity of the aged population, especially as we have, especially as we see extended family shrinking, more immediate family units living together. So this is another area where we worry about, in the absence of policy to address this, what could happen to poverty going forward. And with that, let me stop. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Andy. We've benefited enormously from your wisdom and insights over all these updates, and I want to thank you for this very thoughtful answer. I just want to say a couple of other comments which I want to acknowledge. I think one from Vikram Nehru, who worries that having an internal discussant is too incestuous. So we'll ask Vikram to help us to identify, outside discussants who can speak to the issue of the region, but he's disqualified because he would count as an insider outsider. And then there's a nice comment from Ulfatullah Kotwal, who would like us to add Pashto to the language in our presentation interpretation. And I'm thrilled to see how far the reach of this update is. And I thank you all for really outstanding questions and outstanding responses. And now I turn to our Vice President, Manuela Ferro, who is the person who encouraged us to take a longer view this time, to say some final words. Manuela?
Thank you very much, Aditya, and thanks to the whole team for a very stimulating presentation and very, very thoughtful questions and also good answers. Many of the questions, in a way, help us think about what other topics we should be looking into, what other formats we could use, and we'll certainly take up Vikram on his suggestion. And in a way, this is a region that over the past few decades has overcome a lot. Those that lived through the Asian financial crisis certainly had a few years of real worry, and the situation we are facing today with these overlapping shocks and some underlying worrisome trends really calls for bold reforms and getting more wind in the sails of growth and development in this region. And we do see that many of these topics that are in this report are in the minds of policymakers and analysts and economists throughout the region. So let me just conclude by thanking everyone who worked on this report, thanking all of those that made this very good discussion happen, and thanks to all that joined us today. It was a pleasure. Thank you, everybody. Have a good day or a good evening.
Thank you, Manuela. Thank you, everybody.
Bye.